Chapter 10 When Night Came. Now indeed I seemed in a worse case than before, hitherto except during my night's anguish at the loss of Time Machine. I felt a sustaining hope of ultimate escape, but that hope was staggered by these new conditions. Hitherto I had merely thought myself impeded by the childish simplicity of the little people, and by some unknown forces, which I had only to understand to overcome. But there was an altogether new element and sickening quality to the Morlocks, a something inhuman and malign. Instinctively I loathed them. Before had I felt as a man might feel who had fallen into a pit. My concern was with the pit and how to get out of it. Now I felt like a beast in a trap, whose enemy would come upon him soon. The enemy I dreaded may surprise you. It was the darkness of the new moon. Winna had put this into my head by some at first incomprehensible remarks about the dark nights. It was not now such a very difficult problem to guess what the coming dark nights meant. The moon was on the wane. Each night there was a longer interval of darkness, and now understood to some slight degree at least the reason of the fear of the little upper world people for the dark. I wondered vaguely what foul villainy it might be that the Murlocs did under the new moon. I felt pretty sure now that my second hypothesis was all wrong. The upper world people might once have been the favored archaeocracy, and the Morlocks their mechanical servants, but that had long since passed away. The two species that had resulted from the evolution of man were sliding down towards, or already arrived at, an altogether new relationship. The Aeoli, like the Carvinal kings, had decayed to a mere beautiful fealty. They still possessed the earth on sufferance, since the Morlocks, subterranean for innumerable generations, had come at last to find the daylight surface intolerable, and the Morlocks made their garments. I inferred, and maintained them in their habitual needs, perhaps through the survival of an old habit or service. They did it as a standing horse paws with his foot, or as a man enjoys killing animals in sport, because ancient departed necessities had impressed it on the organism. But clearly the old order was already in part reversed. The nemesis of the dedicated ones was creeping on a space. Ages ago, thousands of generations ago, man had thrust his brother man out of the ease and sunshine, and now that brother was coming back changed. Already, Eloi had begun to learn one old lesson anew. They were becoming reacquainted with fear, and suddenly there came into my head the memory of the meat I had seen in the underworld. It seemed odd how it floated into my mind, not straight up as if it were a current of my meditations, but something in almost like a question from the outside. I tried to recall the form of it. I had a vague sense of something familiar, but I could not tell it was at the time. Still, however helpless the little people in the presence of their mysterious fear, I was differently constituted. I came out of this age of ours, this ripe prime of human race, when fear does not paralyze and mystery does lost its terrors. I at least would defend myself. Without further delay, I determined to make myself arms and fastenable where I may sleep. With that refuge as a base, I could face the strange world with some of what confidence I had lost in realizing to what creatures night by night I lay exposed. I felt I could never sleep again until my bed was secure for them. I shuddered with horror to think how they must already have examined me. I wandered during the afternoon along the valley of Thames, but found nothing that commended itself to my mind as unacceptable. All the buildings and trees seemed easily participable to such dexterous climbers as the Morlocks, to judge by their wells must be. Then the tall pinnacles of the Palace of Greenparkline and the polished gleam of its walls came back to my memory, and in the evening, taking went out like a child upon my shoulder, I went up the hills towards the southwest. The distance I had reckoned was 7 or 8 miles, but it must have been near 18. I had first seen the palace on a moist afternoon when distances are deceptively diminished. In addition, the heel of one of my shoes was loose, and a nail was working through the sole. They were comfortable old shoes I wore about indoors, so that I was lame, and it was already long past sunset when I came sight in the place, silhouetted back against the pale yellow of the sky. When I had been hugely delighted when I began to carry her, but after a while she desired me to let her down, and run alongside by me, occasionally darting off on either hand to pick flowers to stick to my pockets. My pockets had always puzzled Lena, but at the last she had concluded that they were eccentric kind of vessels for floral decorations. At least she utilized them for that purpose. And that reminds me, I am changing my jacket. I found. The time traveler paused, put his hand into his pocket, and silently placed two withered flowers, not unlike very large white mallows, upon the little table. Then resumed his narrative. As the hush of the evening crept over the world, we proceeded over the hill crest towards Wimbledon. Winter grew tired and wanted to return to the house of Greystone, but I pointed out to the distant pinnacle of the palace of green porcelain to her, and contrived to make her understand that we were seeking refuge there from her fear. You know, that great pause that comes upon things before dusk. Even the breeze stops in the trees. To me, there is always an air of expectation about the evening stillness. The sky was clear, remote, and empty, save for a few horizontal bars far down in the sunset. Well, that night the expectation took the color of my fears. In that darkling came my sense seemed particularly naturally sharpened. I fancied I could even feel the hollowness of the ground beneath my feet, could indeed almost see through it, the Morlocks on their ant hill going hither and waiting for the dark. In my excitement, I fancied they had received my invasion of their burrows as a declaration of war, and why had they taken my time machine? So it went on in the quiet, and the light had deepened into night. The clear blue of the distance faded, and one star after another came out. The ground grew dim and the trees black. Wenda's fear and her fatigue grew upon her. I took her into my arms and talked to her and caressed her. Then, as the darkness grew deeper, she put her arms around my neck and closing her eyes, tightly pressing her face against my shoulders. So we went down a long slope into a valley, and there in the distance I walked into a little river. This I waded and went up to the opposite side of the valley, past a number of sleeping houses, and past a statue, a faun or some figure, minus the head. Here were two archaeas. So far I had seen nothing of the Morlocks, but it was yet nearly in the night, and the darker hours before the old moon rose were still to come. From the brow of the next hill I saw thick woods spreading wide and black before me. I hesitated at this. I could see no ending of it, either to the night or the left. Feeling tired, my feet in particular were very sore. I carefully lowered Lena from my shoulder as I halted, and sat down upon the turf. I could no longer see the palace of green porcelain, and I was in doubt of my direction. I looked at the thickness of the wood and thought of what it might hide. Other than a dense tangle of bushes, that one would be out of sight of the stars. Even where there was no looking danger, a danger I did not care to let my imagination loose upon, there would still be all the roots to stumble over and tree boles to strike against. I was very tired, too, after the excitements of the day, so I decided that I would not face it, but would pass the night upon the open hill. Wena, I was glad to find, was fast asleep. I carefully wrapped her in my jacket and sat down upon her to wait for the moonrise. The hillside was quiet and deserted, but from the back of the wood there now came the stir of living things. Above me shone the stars, for the night was very clear. I felt a certain sense of friendly comfort in their twinkling. All the old constellations had gone from the sky, however, and the slow movement, which is imperceptible in 100 human lifetimes, had long since rearranged them in the unfamiliar groupings. But the Milky Way, it seemed to me, was still some tattered streamer of stardust as of yore. Southward, as I judged it, was very bright star that was new to me. It was even more splendid than our own great Sirius, and amid all these scripted points of light, one brighter planet shone kindly and steadily like the face of an old friend. Looking at the stars suddenly dwarfed my own troubles and all the gravities of terrestrial life. I thought of their unfathomable distance, and the slow, inevitable drift of their movements out to the unknown past into unknown future. I thought of the great precessional cycle that the pole of the earth describes. Only 40 times had the silent revolution occurred during all the years I had traversed, and during these few revolutions all the activity, all the traditions and complex organisms and nations, languages, literatures, aspirations, and even the mere memory of man as I knew him, had been swept out of existence. Instead, were all these frail creatures who had forgotten their high ancestry, and the white things of which I went in terror. Then I thought of the great fear that was between the two species. For the first time a sudden shiver came, the clear knowledge of what the meat I had seen might be. Yet it was too horrible. I looked at little Wetta sleeping beside me. Her face was white and starlight under the stars, and forthright dismissed the thought. Through long night I held my mind off the Morlocks as well as I could, and while away the time by trying to fancy I could find signs of old constellations in the new confusion. The sky kept very clear, except for a hazy cloud or so. No doubt I dozed at times. Then, as my vigil wore on, came a faintness on the evening sky, like a reflection of some colorless fire, and the old moon rose, thin and peaked with white. And close behind, and overtaking it, and overflowing it, the dawn came, pale at first, and then growing pink and warm. No Morlocks approached us. Indeed, I had seen none upon the hill that night, and in confidence of renewed day, it almost seemed to me that my fear had become unreasonable. I stood up and found my foot in the loose heel swollen at the ankle and painful under the heel. So I sat down again and took off my shoe and flung them away. I awakened Wena, and when we went down into the wood, now green and pleasant instead of black and forgetting, we found some fruit wherewith to break our fast. We soon met others of dainty ones, laughing and dancing in the sunlight, as though there were no such thing in nature as night. And then I thought once more the meat I had seen. I felt sure now what it was, and from the bottom of my heart I pitied this last feeble rill from the great flood of humanity. Clearly, at some time in the long ago of humanity, the Morlocks' food had run out. Possibly they had lived on rats and such like vermin. Even now, man is far less discriminating and elusive in his food than he was, far less than any monkey. His prejudice against human flesh is no deep-seated instinct, and so these unhuman sons of men. He tried to look at the thing in scientific spirit. After all, they were more or less human and more remote than our cannibal ancestors of 3,000, 4,000 years ago. And the intelligence that would have made this state of things a torment had gone. Why should I trouble myself? These only are mere fatted cattle, which the ant-like Morlocks preserved and preyed upon, proudly saw to the breeding of, and there was Wena dancing at my side. After I tried to preserve myself from the horror that was coming upon me by regarding it as a righteous punishment of human selfishness, man had been content to live in ease and delighted upon the labors of his fellow men, had taken necessity his watchword and excuse, and in the fullness of time necessity had come home to him. I even tried a Carly-like scorn of this wretched oxy in decay. But this attitude of mine was impossible, however great their intellectual degeneration. They only had kept too much of the human form not to claim my sympathy, and to make me perforce and share in their degradation and their fear. I had at the time very vague ideas as to the course I should pursue. My first was to consider some safe place of refuge, and to make myself such arms of metal or stone as I could contrive. That necessity was immediate. In the next place, I hoped to pursue some means of fire, so I could have the weapon of a torch at hand, for nothing, I knew, would be more efficient against these Morlocks. Then I wanted to arrange some contrive to break down doors of bronze out of the White Phoenix. I had in mind a battering ram. I thought I had a persuasion that if I could enter these doors and carry a blaze of light in me, I should discover the time machine and escape. I could not imagine the Morlocks were strong enough to move it far away. Wena and I resolved to bring with me to our time. In turning such schemes over in my mind, I pursued our way towards the building in my fancy had chosen as our dwelling. It may be, of course, that the floor did not slope, but the museum was built into the side of a hill. The end I had come in at was quite above ground, and was lit by rare slit-like windows. As you went down the length, the ground came up against these windows until at last there was a pit like the area of a London house before each, and only a narrow line of daylight at the top. I went slowly along, puzzling about the machines, and had been too intent upon them to notice the gradual diminution of the light, until Wena's increasing apprehensions drew my attention. Then I saw the gallery ran down into thick darkness. I hesitated, and then, as I looked round me, I saw that the dust was less abundant, and its surface less even. Further away towards the dimness, it appeared to be broken by a number of small, narrow footprints. My sense of the immediate presence of Morlocks received at that. I felt that I was wasting my time in the academic examination of the machinery. It called to mind that it was already far advanced in the afternoon, and I still had no weapon, no refuge, and no means of making fire. And then down in the remote plexus of the gallery I had heard particular pattering, the same odd noises I had heard down the well. I took Wena's hand, then, struck with the sudden idea, I left her and turned to the machine. From the projected a lever, those alike in a single box. Clambering upon the stand, and grasping the lever in my hands, I pulled all my weight upon it sideways. Suddenly, Wena, deserted in the central aisle, began to whimper, and I judged the strength of the lever pretty correctly, for it snapped over a minute's strain, and I rejoined her with a mace in my hand, more than sufficed, I judged, for any Morlock skull I might encounter, and that I longed very much to kill a Morlock or so. Very inhuman, you may think, to want to kill one's own descendants, but it was impossible, somehow, to feel any humanity in the things. Only my disinclination to leave Wena, and a persuasion that if I began to slake for my thirst of murder, my time machine might suffer, restrained me from going straight down the gallery and kill the brutes I heard. Well, mace in one hand and Wena in the other, I went out of that gallery and into another, and still larger one, which at first glance reminded me of a military chapel hung with tattered flags. The brown and charred rags that hung from the sides of it I had presently recognized as decaying vestiges of books. They had long since dropped to pieces, and every resemblance of print had left them. But there were warped boards and cracked metallic clasps that told the tale well enough. I had a literary man. I might perhaps have moralized upon the humanity of admiration, but as it was, the thing that struck me with the keenest force that was enormous waste of labor, to which somber willingness of writing paper testified. At the time I still confess that I thought chiefly upon the psychology transactions, and my own 17th papers upon physical optics. Then, going up to a broad staircase, we came to what may have once been a gallery of technical chemistry, and there I had not a little hope of useful discoveries, except that one end of the roof had collapsed. This gallery was well preserved. I went eagerly to every unbroken case, and at last, in one of the really airtight cases, I found a box of matches. Very eagerly I tried them. They were perfectly good. They were not even damp. I turned to Wetta. "Dance," I cried to her in her own tongue. For now I had a weapon indeed against the horrible creatures we feared. And so, in the Dialect Museum, upon the thick carpeting dust, to Wetta's huge light, I slowly performed a kind of composite dance, whistling "The Land of Leal" as cheerfully as I could. In part of it was almost canon, in part a step dance, in part a skirt dance, and in part original, for I am naturally attentive, as you know. Now, I still think that for this box of matches to have escaped the wear of time for immemorable years is a most strange. As for me, it was a most fortunate thing. Yet, oddly enough, I found a far unlikelier substance. That was Kenter. I found it sealed in a jar that, by chance, I suppose, had been really hermetically sealed. I fancied at first it was paraffin wax, and smashed the glass accordingly, but the odor of camphor was unmistakable. In the universal decay of its violet substance, it chanced to survive. Perhaps through many thousand centuries. It reminded me of a Spina painting I had once seen done from the ink of a fossil Williamite that must have perished and had become fossilized millions of years ago. I was about to throw it away, but then I remembered how it was inflammable and burnt with a good, bright flame. Was, in fact, an excellent candle, and I put it in my pocket. I found no explosives, however, nor any means of breaking down the bronze doors. As yet, my own karma was the most helpful thing I had chanced upon. Nevertheless, I left the gallery greatly elated. I cannot tell you all the story of that afternoon. It would require great effort of memory to recall my explorations in all proper order. I remembered a long gallery of rusting stands of arms, and how I hesitated between my crowbar and a hatchet or a sword. I could not carry both, however, and my borrowed iron promised best against the bronze gates. There were numbers of guns, pistols, and rifles, and the most of the masses were rust, but many were of some new metal, and still fairly sound. But any cartridges or powder that may have once been had been rotted into dust. One corner I saw was charred and shattered, perhaps, I thought, by an explosion among the specimens. In another place was a vast variety of idols, Polynesian, Mexican, Grecian, Pelasian, every country on earth I could think. And there, yielding no irresistible impulse, I wrote my name upon the nose of a steel-light muster from South America that particularly took my fancy. As the evening drew on, my interest waned. I went through the gallery after gallery, dusty, silent, often ruinous. The exhibits sometimes were mere heaps of rust and lignite, sometimes fresher. In one place I suddenly found myself near the model of a tin mine, and then, by the merest accident, I discovered in an airtight case 2 dynamite cartridges. I shouted "Eureka!" and smashed the case with joy. Then came a doubt. I hesitated, then selected a little side of the gallery, I made my essay. I never felt such a disappointment as I did in waiting 5, 10, 15 minutes for an exposure that never came. Of course, the thing were dummies, as I might have guessed from their presence. I really believe that had not been so. I should have rushed off incontinently and blown Phoenix, bronze doors, and my chances of finding the time machine altogether into non-existence. It was after that, I think, that we came to a little open court within the palace. It was turfed and had 3 fruit trees, so we rested and refreshed ourselves. Towards sunset, I began to consider our position. Night was creeping upon us, and my inaccessible hiding place had still to be found. But that troubled me very little now. I had in my possession a thing that was perhaps the best of all defenses against Morlocks, and had matches. I had the camphor in my pocket too, if a blaze were needed. It seemed to me that the best thing we could do would be to pass the night in the open, protected by fire. In the morning, there was the getting of the time machine. Towards that, as yet, I had only my iron mace, but now, with my growing knowledge, I felt very different towards those broad doors. Up to this, I had refrained from forcing them, largely because of the mystery on the other side. They had never impressed me as being very strong, and I hoped to find my borrowed iron not altogether inadequate for the work. Chapter 12. In the Darkness. We emerged from the palace while the sun was still in part above the horizon. I determined to reach the White Phoenix early the next morning, and ere the dusk I purposed pushing through the woods that had stopped me on my previous journey. My plan was to go as far as possible that night, and then build a fire to sleep in the protection of its glare. Accordingly, we went along, and I gathered any sticks or dried grass I saw, and presented my arms full of litter. Thus loaded, our progress was slower than I anticipated, and besides, Wena was tired, and I also began to suffer from sleepiness too, so that it was the full night before we reached the wood. Upon the shrubby hill of its edge, Wena would have stopped, fearing the darkness before us, but a singular sense of impending calamity that should have indeed have served me as a warning drove me onward. I had been without sleep for a night and 2 days, and I was feverishly and irritable. I felt sleep upon me, and the Morlocks with it. While we hesitated among the black bushes behind us, and dim against the blackness, I saw 3 crouching figures. They would scrub along grass all about us. I did not feel safe from their insidious approach. The forest, I calculated, was rather less than a mile across. If we could get through it all to the bare hillside, there, as it would seem to me, was an altogether safer resting place. I thought that with my matches and my camphor I could contrive to keep my path illuminated through the woods. Yet it was evident that if I was to flourish matches with my hands, I should have to abandon my firewood. So I rather reluctantly put it down, and then it came to my head that I would amaze our friends behind by lighting it. I was about to discover the atrocious folly of this proceeding, but it came to my mind that it was an ingenious move to cover our retreat. I don't know if you could ever thought that a rare thing, flame, must mean the absence of man in a temperature climate. The sun's heat is rarely strong enough to burn, even when it's focused by dewdrops. But, as sometimes the case in more tropical districts, lightning may blast and blacken, but it rarely gives rise to widespread fire. Decaying vegetation may occasionally smolder with heat of its fermentation, but this rarely results in flame. In this destination, too, the art of fire-making had been forgotten on earth. The red tongues that went licking upon my heap of wood were also a new stranger thing to Wena. She wanted to run to it and play with it. I believe she would have cast herself into it had I not restrained her, but I caught up to her, and in spite of her struggles, plunged boldly before me into the wood. For a little away, the glare of the fire lit the path. Looking back presently, I could see through the crowded stems that from my heap of sticks ablaze that spread to some bushes adjacent, and the curved line of fire was creeping up the grass of the hill. I laughed at that and turned back to the darkness before me. It was very dark. When it clung to me convulsively, but there was still, as my eyes grew accustomed to the darkness, suffocating light for me to avoid the stems. Over here it was simply black, except for there was a gap of remote blue sky shone upon us, and here and there. I lit none of my matches because I had no hand free. Upon my left hand I carried my little one, and in my right I had my iron bar. For some way I heard nothing but the crack of twigs under my feet, the faint rustle of breeze above, and my own breathing, and the throb of the blood vessels in my ears. Then I seemed to know the pattering behind me. I pushed on grimly. The pattering grew more distinct, and then I caught the same queer sound of voices I had heard in the underworld. They were evidently several of the Murlocs, and they were closing in upon me. Indeed, in another minute I felt a tug on my coat, and then something on my arm, and when I shivered violently, and became quite still. It was time for a match, but to get one out, I must put her down. So I did. As I fumbled it with my pocket, struggle began in the darkness about my knees, perfectly silent on her part, and with the same particular cooing sounds from the Murlocs. Soft little hands, too, were creeping over my coat and back, touching even my neck. Then the match scratched and fizzled. I held it flaring, and saw the white backs of the Murlocs in flight amid the trees. I hastily took a lump of copper and prepared to light it as soon as the match should wane. Then I looked at Weta. She was lying clutching my feet and quite motionless, her face to the ground. With sudden fright, I stooped to her. She seemed scarcely to breathe. I lit the block of camphor and flung it to the ground. As it split and flared up, it drove back the Morlocks in the shadows. I knelt down and lifted her. The wood behind seemed to full of stir and murmur of a great company. She seemed to have fainted. I put her carefully upon my shoulder and rose to push on, and then there came a horrible realization. In maneuvering with my own watches and Weta, I had turned myself about several times, and now I had not the faintest idea in what direction lay my path. For all I knew, I might be facing back towards the palace of Green Porklean. I found myself in cold sweat. I had to think rapidly what to do. I determined to build a great fire in encampment where we are. I put Weta, still motionless, down on a turfy bowl, and very hastily, as my first lump of corporal lane, I began collecting sticks and leaves. There, here and there, out of the darkness round me, the Morlocks' eyes shone like curlicues. The camphor flickered and went out. I lit a match, and as I did so, two white forms began approaching. Weta dashed heavily away. One was blinded by the light that he came straight for me, and I felt his bones grind under the blow of my fist. He gave a whoop of dismay, staggered a little way, and fell down. I lit another piece of camphor and went on gathering my bonfire. Presently I noticed how the sky some of the foliage above me, since my arrival of the time machine. In a matter of a week no rain had fallen, so instead of casting down among the trees and fallen twigs, I began leaping up and dragging down branches. Very soon I had a choking, smoking fire of green wood and dry sticks, and could recognize my camphor. Then I turned to where Weta lay motionless beside my iron mace. I tried for what I could receive her, but she lay like a dead one. I could not even satisfy myself whether or not she breathed. Now the smoke of the fire beat towards me, and it must have made me heavy of a sudden. Moreover, the vapor of camphor was filling the air. My fire would not need replenishing for an hour or so. I felt very weary after my exertion and sat down. The wood, too, was full of some murderous murmur that I did not understand. I seemed just to nod and open my eyes, but all was dark, and the Murlocs had their hands upon me, flinging off their clinging fingers. I hastily felt my pocket for the matchbox, and it had gone. They gripped and closed with me. In a moment I knew what had happened. I had slept and my fire had gone out. The bitterness of death came over my soul. The forest seemed full of smell of burning wood. I was caught by the neck, by the hair, by the arms, and pulled down. It was incredibly horror. In the darkness, feel these soft creatures leap upon me. I felt as if in a monstrous spider web. I was overpowered and went down. I felt little teeth nipping at my neck. I rolled over, and as I did, my hand came upon my iron lever, and it gave me strength. I struggled up, shaking the human rats from me, and holding the bar short, I thrust where I judged their faces to be. I feel the succulent giving of flesh and bone under my blows, and for a moment I was free. The strange exultation that was so often seen to accompany hard fighting came to me. I knew that both I and Weta were lost, but I determined to make the Morlocks pay for their meat. I stood with my back to a tree, swinging the iron bar before me. The whole wood was full of stir and cries of them. A minute passed, and their voices seemed to rise to a higher pitch of excitement. Their movements grew faster, yet none came within reach. I stood glaring into the blackness. Then suddenly came hope. What if the Murlocs were afraid? And close on my heels came a stranger thing. The darkness seemed to grow luminous. Very dimly I began to see Morlocks about me. 3 battered at my feet, and then I recognized, with incredulous surprise, the others were running, in an infinite stream, as it seemed, from behind me and away from the wood in front, and their backs seemed no longer white, but reddish. As I stood agape, I saw a little red spark go drifting across the gap of starlight between the branches and vanish, and at that I thought I understood the smell of burning wood, the slumberous murmur that was growing now to a gusty roar, and the red glow of the Murloc's flight. Stepping out from behind my tree, looking back, I saw through the pillars of near trees the flames of the burning forest. It was my first fire coming after me, which that I looked for Weta, but she was gone. The hiss of the crackling behind me, explosive thud as each fresh tree burst into flame, left little time for reaction. My iron bar still gripped. I followed the Murloc's path. It was a close race. Once the flames crept forward so swiftly on my right as I ran, that I was outflanked and had to strike off to the left. But at last I emerged upon a small open space, and as I did so, a Murloc came blustering towards me and past me, and went straight into the fire. And now I was to see the most weird and horrible thing. I think of all that I beheld a future ago. This whole space was as bright as day with the reflection of fire. In the center of the hilltop or terrace, surrounded by scorched hawthorn, below was another arm of the burning forest, with yellow tongues already withering from it, completely circling the space with the fence of fire. Upon the hillside there were some 30 or 40 Murlocs, dazed by the light and heat, and bubbling hither and thither against each other in bewilderment. At first I did not realize their blindness, and struck furious at them with my bar. The frenzy of fear as they approached me, killing one, crippling several more. But when I had watched the gestures of one of them groping under the hawthorn against the red sky, and heard their moans, I was sure of their absolute helplessness and misery in the glare, and I struck no more of them. Yet every now and then one of them would come straight towards me, letting loose a quiver of horror, and make me think to elude him. At one time the flames died down somewhat, and I feared the foul creatures would presently be able to see me. I was thinking of beginning the fight by killing some of them before this should happen, but the fire burst out again greedily, and I stayed my hand. I walked about the hill among them and avoided them, looking for some trace of Weta, but Weta was gone. At last I sat down on the summit of the hillock, and watched the strange, incredible company of blind things grope to and fro, making uncanny noises to each other as the glare of the fire beat on them. The coiling uprush of smoke seemed across the sky, and through the rare tatters of that red canopy remote as they belonged to another universe, shone the little stars. 2 or 3 murlocs came blundering into me, and I drove them off with blows of my fists, trembling as I did so. For most of the part of the night, I was persuaded it was a nightmare. I bit myself and screamed in a passionate desire to be awake. I beat the ground with my hands and got up and sat down again, and wandered here and there, and again sat down. Then I would fall to rubbing my eyes, calling upon God to let me awake. Thrice I saw Morlocks put their heads down in a kind of agony and rush into the flames, but at last some subsiding red of the fire. Above the shooting masses of black smoke and whitening blackening tree stumps. The diminishing numbers of these dim creatures came to the light of day. I searched again for traces of Wenna, but there were none. It was plain they had left the poor little body in the forest. I could not describe how it relieved me to think that it had escaped the awful fate to which it seemed destined. As I thought of that, I almost moved to begin a massacre of the helpless abominations about me. But I contained myself. The hillock, as I have said, was a kind of island in the forest. From its summit I could now make out through the haze of smoke the palace of Green Pork Lane, and from that I could get my bearings for the White Phoenix. And so, leaving the remnant of these damned souls still going hither and thither and moaning. As the day grew clearer, I tried some of the grass about my feet and limped on, across smoking ashes and along blackening stems, and still pulsated internally with fire. Towards the hiding place of the time machine, I walked slowly, for I was almost exhausted, as well as lame. I felt the incessant wretchedness for the horrible death of little Wenna. It seemed an overwhelming calamity. Now, in this odd familiar room, it was more like the sorrow of a dream than an actual loss. But that morning it left me absolutely lonely again, terribly alone. I began to think of this house of mine, of this fireside, of some of you, and which such thing came aloning that was pain. But I walked over the smoldering ashes under the bright morning sky. I made a discovery. In my trouser pocket were still some loose matches. The box must have leaked before it was lost.